Hello everyone, happy winter solstice. Today in the boreal hemisphere the sun has risen again. For this reason I decided to discuss, as you can see, a very important topic that I should have really presented to you in many dedicated videos from quite a long time. There is something definitely metaphysical about this, in fact, astronomic alignment, the Schwerpunkt, and its meaning. I will not discuss, of course, why or how I came to mention Schwerpunkt as a title for the channel. In many ways, it's self-explanatory. Today, we really talk about the Schwerpunkt in the Clausewitzian theory. Many, actually most of you, subscribed to my channel after great changes that occurred, especially around 4 years ago, that would be much sort of more explanatory than probably most of what I've done up to this point. In these ensuing years, I started back in the day a series dedicated to the reading and commentary of von Clausewitz vom Kriege. Everything that I had to say, as far, in fact, as we covered the von Kriege, we arrived up to 3/4, even surpassed that, and then I suspended it, is contained in that series, is explained there, does not require, in fact, further explanation other than the one that I gave at the time. Naturally, today I see things even better than then, but in many ways it's just there, properly the word of von Clausewitz explaining the war. And my further highlights on how and why this 19th century military man, other than just a military theorist, and, by the way, military historian, great military historian for his age, is truly the unparalleled paradigm, his theory, like his system, for understanding what war fundamentally is, right? And I will not digress further on how or why we haven't come to fully appreciate that, how even the global armed forces, regardless of the fact, of course, that they know from Clausewitz, that they have heard of him, and that many sort of military men did study him and so on, have actually not really understood and integrated and adapted properly these theory of the art of war for, in fact, the sake of greater strategic proficiency. Nor this is going to be the video in which, again, I'm going to discuss this further. What I mean is that this channel discussed the Clausewitzian theory, was heavily informed by the same. If anything, in a military historical method, I talked about this, for example, this year that is about to end, last summer, in that article that Italian military history journal literally asked me to write. It's really a column, right? They couldn't sponsor a YouTube channel, but they literally contacted me. I decided to describe the channel mostly through, obviously, what this has always been, right? So for any of you, that's an open source paper, by the way. You can easily find it if you Google Schwerpunkt. It should appear readily among the first results. There, I also articulate essentially what it's meant for me. In that case, was a modern warfare sort of cut, like a story. I didn't talk about ancient, medieval, or contemporary warfare, but I was observing how the Clausewitzian theory is necessary in order to reacquire strategic literacy. Again, I will not explain, once again, how and why this has, in relative terms, sunk compared to times in history in which war was, in a sense, simpler, but not for this reason easier at all. And where, in this sense, men were much more connected with the same. Probably some of you will be surprised to know, even though I often reiterated that I came to my most sort of watched religious history content through military history, in particular the Clausewitzian philosophy, if you want, because we're talking not just a contemporary, but a student of Kant and Hegel, right? You can't really say, but Sun Tzu said, like, you can't like destroy millennial history and difference between West and Eastern, not way to war, which actually is universally the same, but way to describe that and to approach it theoretically, say looking at the theories of the time from Clausewitz, one of the time of Pythagoras, all right? I've always been aware that exactly because of the literacy of most people, in essence, about strategic culture, education, military history, probably the history of the art of war, that it is necessary to talk about von Clausewitz. And after years of sort of inner reflection, also things that really happened in my life, so I decided to come back to von Clausewitz, not because I ever abandoned it, but I mean on Schwerpunkt and perhaps even with the series. The sad reason why I interrupted, but I didn't stop, the uploads from the von Kriege, that if you remember we sort of in fact made a video for each paragraph of the work, stemmed mostly from the fact that most of you, even though very eager to listen to the beginning of the series, why von Clausewitz is important and so on, regularly wouldn't watch the rest of the von Kriege. And so I have these videos that received at some point, I don't know, 50 views, etc. Like the first one has, I don't know, multiple thousands views, whereas the rest sort of died out. And it's not like as I was just saying, I ever abandoned von Clausewitz. As I said before, even what I describe, religiously speaking, stems heavily from what I learned from the von Kriege, right? There is a definitive overlapping between the Clausewitzian, the Catholic, and the Indo-European Trinity, for example. And there is a very specific archetypal reason. I think nobody has really ever studied this. I also made an actual video explaining this from who are the persons of the wonderful Trinity that von Clausewitz discusses. And you understand also how fairly complex but deep the Clausewitzian theory is, because if you remember, for those of you who have followed the series, that is objectively very interesting, because you really learn essentially how to think war, which is very different from how people think that, strategy is like applying that into marketing or all that BS. Those are the people who go bankrupt immediately, by the way, just like they wouldn't even know how to start a war, as a matter of fact. And that is very much, in fact, something else from notionism, from something that, by the way, you can approach simply by yourself, meaning that you should be minimally literate from a philosophical, historical, also linguistic point of view. You can't really get the core of the von Kriege without knowing German, for example. So also, like, good translations can help, but they're never quite just the only thing. I personally made the series in English because it was easier for everyone, but obviously the vision that I acquired to the von Kriege is the one that I, in a sense, continued the von Kriege series through all the other military history videos that I've made so far. All right, but just for anyone that wonders about this, just know that you can search the von Kriege playlist. It comes as a shocker because, again, YouTube is weird. Some people don't realize even how I birthed the channel, the story of it, what I went through. Nothing sort of out of the ordinary, really. However, still, I think particularly important because, as we'll understand now, the Schwerpunkt has a quite core principle function. Today we will really make a military theory video, so this is not some broader criticism about other facts and so on. We will have probably to explain individual parts of the wall with examples, digressions and so on, but we literally stick to the core principle of the Schwerpunkt, the meaning of which is perhaps not just, say, the most important thing, because in general, like, this is important as far as you understand what it means in the Clausewitzian theory, that, as we just explained, it's not something you can simply understand from a day to another, not just because it's very complex, but because it really requires a heavy work of demolishing of an incredibly common amount of misconceptions that fundamentally lay in the failure of humanity, in fear and ignorance, in sort of properly of incapacity. But because, in fact, if you Google, for example, what is the Schwerpunkt, I could do it now, but I I've already done it. It would be wasted time to check it. I may make a video like with all the dumb answers of what is the Schwerpunkt. It mostly turns out like things like the Schwerpunkt is a tactic. It's about Blitzkrieg, which wasn't even at that called, by the way, that way, as you know. Like Bewegungskrieg is sort of the proper term in the historical reference, but that, in fact, mostly people have heard from World War II, maybe video games, all this, and they have no idea what it is. They think it's merely some sort of application of the military theoretical meaning of what the Schwerpunkt is, whereas von Clausewitz is actually explaining what war is, and in this sense, what the Schwerpunkt is in war, right? So it's not a tactic, it's not, as we'll see now, even some sort of pre-packed system of winning wars in the relative contingents of each. It's mostly like, a mind opener regarding how war works and why we should be able to identify the Schwerpunkt of our opponents as well as our own, because the Krieg is also a very introspective work. It's primarily sort of working through, say, an intellectual lens that is not, as people think, it's not action, it's not about, going out there and doing anything, because you get killed if you don't know these things. And that, in fact, is a great civilizational booster in the moment in which you realize, as we've seen also in the videos about Indo-European theology, about tradition, that you can't have a plenitude in, for example, a substance without form, right? In sort of courage, for example, without knowledge, without determination. Von Clausewitz, by the way, has a very interesting psychological section of his work, which he describes properly these mental processes whereby the spiritual characters that make one person more or less fit to specific military circumstances. And the purpose of the Krieg is naturally the one of informing, through some theoretical insight, the practical experience of the commander in a way that can be, in fact, practically expendable. All right, up to von Clausewitz's times, a full theory of the art of war had never been fully overlapping with the complete, in fact, conceptualization of what this war is and the capacity properly of analyzing it. Naturally, the same von Krieg tells us very well. Von Clausewitz also wrote lots of other things that is just like the manual's opposite, so to say. But that war is a simple business, but not an easy one for sure. So there are some general mental horizons you have to set to tune in with that are normally very distant from the average sort of attention span here, people's occupation, average person's occupation, so on. And we can start with a famous adage, that is to say, a military operation lacking a Schwerpunkt is akin to a man devoid of character. I use it also as the motto of the channel, as a matter of fact, as you can see on it. And this phrase comes from General Paul Ludwig Hans Anton von Benedendorf und von Hindenburg, right? Of the many ideas put forth by Karl von Clausewitz in his seminal work, Von Krieg, the concept of Schwerpunkt is truly the core principle. It stands out as having the most significant impact on the development of modern military strategy for what, again, could be understood by modern military strategists, particularly in shaping, also the Bewegungskrieg, what is more commonly known as the Blitzkrieg doctrine. I shall make videos on this, but again, it's not simply the point. The doctrine of the German armed forces in World War II was more the product of this, as we've seen before, like innovative and conservative, modern and traditional, that the German armed forces had historically sort of come to learn through, in fact, the theoretical insights of the same von Clausewitz that had de facto created, like in his following generation, like the same the same united Germany, its armed forces, especially under von Moltke, as you know, that also studied these. Every commander in that sense had some slightly different understanding of von Clausewitz's theory, because it's not easy to understand, right? Just think about even the proper misconception. Certain historians, like even people teaching at Sandhurst, or the champions of culturalism in an oppositional, antagonistic sense towards von Clausewitz, people who have not even opened the Volkskrieg, as a matter of fact, once in their lives, and that therefore have really muddied the waters a little bit as far as also the broader popular understanding of the Volkskrieg was. And there is a whole story of the work, because paradoxically, the Volkskrieg was very much successful, right, as a publication, so to say, among civilians, as opposed to, for example, Jomini's work that was much more appreciated, at least initially well received by the military, with his author actually admitting, and I'm going to make a video about Jomini because it's a very interesting figure, that von Clausewitz, after all, had been his greatest opponent. Well, Jomini lived for a very long time. As you know, von Clausewitz died in his 50s during the Polish insurrection in the 1830s, exactly while he was finishing the work. And there is this extraordinary history, this notes that he left while he was actively dying. Right? He was, fell ill, and he literally said, just bear in mind, for all the discussion, by the way, that happened later, that this work is right, that I had to finish it. Right? He died in November. The work should have been finished by February in his estimate. And it was, by the way, already it was finished, really, considering that he had been working at that for decades. So it was a lifetime of research, of inquiry, of testing. Also, as a commander, von Clausewitz had an very interesting and non-secondary role in the operations just before Waterloo, as a matter of fact, in the Prussian army. And that, in this sense, should be understood beyond all the criticism, the complaints, the sort of, but von Clausewitz, I don't understand this, or he's contradicting himself. Von Clausewitz is, again, providing us with a system, with a method. Every part of the Volkskrieg is interdependent with the other, right? So the people tend, for example, to go like at the supermarket of citations and paste and copy things that they don't understand, because they have not made the work of reading and understanding, which are two very different things, or studying for that matter, translating even the work, and realizing in which context certain expressions that are very changing. And they are changing because of the nature of war. At some point, von Clausewitz literally compares it to a chameleon, all right? And there, for example, people began to say, well, so war is always different. And people don't understand that there are different levels of that difference, that there is even actually a veiled metaphysical implication in what von Clausewitz is saying, even though, in fact, he doesn't discuss, but fundamentally a military dimension. At most, military dimension as an instrument of politics with other means. And in that sense, it's a work that fascinates you. It's something deeply potent, magical, only once that you really enter into it, in which you make probably the hard work of saying, okay, now it's me and the work, and I have to study it for years and really getting into it, because it really takes the time. And when you actually do it, you realize that the work, as intimidating as it is, if you start reading it just randomly, is actually, after all, very intelligible, right? Von Clausewitz is often credited, again, by alleged critics that, you don't never understand what he fully meant. Here, he's anachronic. But when you actually read it, it's self-explanatory. I mean, any kind of question that you can ask, what did von Clausewitz actually think about this? There are some things that are pretty complex. Naturally, you must work in order to understand. But overall, it's part of a mechanism. I don't know if you've ever studied Kant and Hegel, for example. But Hegel, like it's a type of philosophy that once you have sort of gotten the fundamental mechanism of it's actually very, overall, in its complexity, in its difficulty, it's very understandable, right? Same with von Clausewitz. And I would like, by the way, to reiterate, as I used to do when I cover the series, that when we finish the von Krieg, we will definitely pass to other works, including the military historical ones, Kriegsspiele, and so on. Now, just for telling you how misreceived is the concept of Schwerpunkt, because today we talk just about the Schwerpunkt, right? I have to enshrine it a little bit into the whole context, but the concept of Schwerpunkt holds a prominent position, for example, in the current US military doctrine, which offers, I don't know if they changed this aspect in particular, but it offers this widely adopted, yet, as we will see now, overly simplistic and misleading definition. Right? You would think that the major military in the world at this point, as others, because there is all a story, for example, since Lenin, right, into the Soviet school that, shipwrecked miserable, but they started originally like that. Communists actually misadopted von Clausewitz a bit sort of more largely as an acquisition than the West, paradoxically, right? And this is the definition of Schwerpunkt according to the US military doctrine. Quote, characteristics. When you understand here that, there is already a plural, you understand it's BS. Like somebody has asked you to give a definition, and you may argue that, of course, the Schwerpunkt is such a big concept. It requires some great capacity of abstraction, so you can't reduce it so simply to a definition, because von Clausewitz has, by the way, different ways even of defining the same things throughout the von Krieg. That you will understand methodologically is not definitional, but explainatory functional. All right. In that point of the work, he has to make you understand what that thing means concerning the part of the system that is discussing at the moment. All right. So there are often metaphors in the von Krieg and so on, but the Americans say this: characteristics, capabilities, or sources of power. This is terrible. I can't finish it. From which a military force derives its freedom of action. Oh, Jesus Christ. Physical strength or will to fight. This is literally joint publication 1002, Department of Defense Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. All right. So we will gradually debunk this definition as we will unveil instead properly the Clausewitzian meaning of the Schwerpunkt, right? But there is a lasting relevance of this concept, as you understand, from, after all, a Prussian general military theorist of the early 19th century that resonated in a world like ours that is very different from that one. And this concept, at least in the way also it's described here by the US Armed Forces, appears almost contradictory for two reasons. First, as previously mentioned, a superficial interpretation of the term has spread widely, reducing its complexity. This is not just, as you know, I don't have a problem with the United States in any sense. In theory, in line of principle, I have no problem with any country, even though, as you know, we all have our bias and so on. But this is, in fact, not essentially a U.S. issue. Like, this is the U.S. source of the issue, right? The version of the trouble. But there is a problem in general as a civilization in our world, all over it, right? This is not the West or not the West, like also people of reason in those terms are not in a very good place. And usually, in fact, not in the West. But unfortunately, like lesser people are sort of spreading as a human sort of average anthropic side, let's put it in this way, in our times. The problem lays, unfortunately, in certain ways the military, just like mankind, developed. I also recently made a video about Holy War in the age of dying tradition that shows this. In practice, there is a metaphysical standard. This is how you can understand the von Krieg as well, a bit like what we see in the theology, metaphysical lessons. And war, in that sense, always follows the same axiom. It's always like it's a hyper-real phenomenon. And then every war simply declines itself in a different way, not because these axioms have come less, but because people actually follow the same axioms. War works essentially in the same way. But people are not up to sort of the, in fact, tendentially preferential way of fighting it, right? Because naturally there is, in theory, like in every human endeavor, the perfect way to do something, which is also how the ancients thought that you could become God just by nailing it, right? And that if you think about it, is always inherent, is always present in potential. Doing something right means to follow that invisible trail that is the axiom that leads us to the truth in the same way. So von Clausewitz goes at great length in describing how this is the case for war, described literally at some point as what could be a clash between two cosmic, for example, forces or something like that. The problem with today's military, in large, and mostly in its educational training, let's put it this way, its military historical teaching, is the fact that the military normally is taught some specific modules, some specific schemes of how to do something, right? Or how to move an army, or how to even just, conceive ideally how these relations, also for example, the laws of reciprocity in the Clausewitzian theory are supposed to work and so on. But they're minimized, right? To some sort of, we gave these ideas, but nobody tests it, aside from the fact that the same von Clausewitz says, until you actually fight a war, and not as a single soldier, but as an actual commander, which is what the entire von Kriege is about. Just think about what average people think that wars are won or lost, like the individual guys they mention, all right? It's not like it doesn't pass through him, but very Hegelian sense, of course, everything is in the hands of top commander, and military systems have developed in that hierarchical sense, exactly because they're the most functional in that direction. But they don't go beyond that. For example, right, for Schwerpunkt, as you see, I use pictures, right, the free ones, and among commercially expandable ones, devoid of copyright issues, and there are some West Point maps that are depicting some historical battles that are eventually told to the cadets in the academy, that, however, are completely completely ridiculous, right? They are horrifying approximations of. It's not even that they're wrong in absolute terms, but you understand that they're meant to teach the whole thing in an incredibly superficial way, right? To kids that likely will also go on without any particular education. There are some Clausewitzians historically. For example, Mattis, regardless of how people feel about him because of what happened in the former Trump presidency and so on, but was known as the warrior monk because he apparently had an enormous military historical library, and I resonate with that as much. But he made pretty sort of precise Clausewitzian citations showing that we're not in Mattis's head, but we haven't seen him fighting, a global war yet. But that they're not random, they're not banal citations of the von Kriege, right? But in general, don't think that an officer, even in the higher echelons of the hierarchy, actually has a sound Clausewitzian education, or even knows in line of principle what war is. We've seen this with certain exterminations, for example, of some top sort of military men in certain circumstances, even the Ukrainian war, that have really come up like saying, no, things are like this, things are like that, like no, they're years old BS that disproved itself just through time and events. And that, however, like literally those are the people that should be in the hands of if we go to war. Right? What comforts me in a sense is, at least this was in the old time, that if there was some emergence of compulsory levy, the people with degrees or something, now that the degrees are much more common, the higher the degree, the higher the unit, right? The higher the rank you're going to receive. So, was World War III to break out for the few times it would probably last before our destruction. Probably I would start making experiments with whatever would be given to my command. It's just a bad joke in any case. There is a second point. So von Clausewitz, in his effort to craft a metaphor to encapsulate his analysis, drew from physics. Because, as you know, Schwerpunkt is an untranslatable word, right? It can mean different things because German has some sort of tendentially deeper semantics. It's more similar to ancient European languages that were, as we've seen, routinely much more loaded with sort of different meanings. And so some people translate it as center of gravity or barycenter, right? But it's something very different, and using those words is maybe, as we'll see now, misleading and problematic. That's also why you should be able to translate German or to think in German in some way. In fact, while the saying von Clausewitz, because Schwerpunkt is actually barycenter, also in German, when you're told mass, that literally Schwerpunkt is barycenter, and so von Clausewitz uses, again, this is a very important concept, but there are other metaphors, analogies, etc., as we were saying before. They're also used these relatively banal terms. Remember that this work had to be literally understood by everyone. There are metaphors that are directed to bakers, to simple people, and also it's very high. Like the prose of the Concrete is something incredibly beautiful, even poetic to a degree, but all to the very precise, sort of properly Prussian point of getting to the actual point. That in this case, von Clausewitz took an enormous time to explain to us, but that in this sense, you may want to make the further understanding that is necessary, right, regardless of what people tend to do, because it is a system, and it embraces and encompasses this great thing that war is at the end of the day. In fact, the same physical analogy that von Clausewitz uses with Schwerpunkt as barycenter is applied by the Prussian in a somewhat loose fashion. For example, in Book 6, Chapter 27, he states, we have read this, by the way, already, quote, "The center of gravity is always found where the greatest mass is concentrated, and every blow directed against that center has the greatest effect on the whole, so it must be in war." So it must be in war, but it does not say the mass we're talking here is something specific in war. He is truly referring to a barycenter in a conceptual way. You understand how subtle, even just like what would appear to be a simple phrase, if you get easily distracted, this is not really, it may be actually a good exercise to straighten yourself up, but von Clausewitz says, and therefore the strongest blow must be directed against the Schwerpunkt, this, say, center of gravity. Now, in truth, the center of gravity, center of mass, barycenter, you can call it in different ways if you really need to translate it. And in any case, here, if we refer to the physical one of an object, right, this aligns only with the object if the object has uniform density or possesses specific symmetrical properties and is situated within a uniform gravitational field. This is the point in physics. That's how you can calculate the barycenter. For instance, in a boomerang, the barycenter exists outside the object, notoriously in a region devoid of mass, right? So Clausewitz's use of this physical analogy underscores, in particular, exactly this very emphasis on cohesion rather than total destruction. Because you know that the Schwerpunkt is also, as we'll see now, what the enemy has to disrupt. So already, here we're presented with a very important concept of this whole. That is to say, what matters here, right, for us, is not to understand that you have to go after the enemy's Schwerpunkt, like, a dog after a bone, all right, and crushing your head over, against the enemy, just per se. The point is, first of all, understanding why that is the Schwerpunkt. What is the Schwerpunkt? Because it's not an immediately or readily apparent thing. All right, that is something that von Clausewitz in the Krieg explains us how, say, in a cognitive sense, how to acquire, which largely does come from experience. But von Clausewitz is emphasizing specifically the fact that understanding what the Schwerpunkt is understanding how the enemy armed forces are kept together. And it can be lots of different things. The Schwerpunkt, first of all, as you understand here, definitionally, it's not a tactic. It's not a fixed object. It's not the mass of enemy men. It can be. It can be the number of the enemies. It can be properly a physical concept, a place on the battlefield, for example. But it changes, right? And constantly so. So let's understand better what von Clausewitz means by this. So first of all, yes, targeting the Schwerpunkt results in a decisive and irreversible disruption of the enemy's forces, which serves as both a necessary and sufficient condition, therefore, to neutralize the adversary without needing to annihilate them entirely. Remember the definition, von Clausewitz's definition of war, that is to say, an act of force aimed at compelling the enemy to fulfill our will. Doesn't mean that you have to annihilate up to the last enemy in order to defeat him. All right, physical destruction, as you know, on the battlefield is properly, even just immediately, the psychological, in that sense active principle is the one that you have to curb, right? It's not about how much mayhem, how much physical destruction you cause alone that is going to make the enemy give up, all right? Therefore, also, there is an economic principle. Von Clausewitz makes also economics as among the various things in terms of, the interaction between the two fighters. That trade is something somehow close to how war is fought, is waged. Like it's different blows on different sides, different proposals, different negotiations, after all. In this sense, your objective is, of course, to achieve victory with the least effort possible. And so the idea, this is, you would say, well, also Sun Tzu says that, well, this is obvious, it's a universal concept, but it's not like Sun Tzu explains this as von Clausewitz. Sun Tzu says you should never besiege cities. Because at the time of Jew warfare, when it was there was this, adage that since chariot warfare was preponderant and that bogged down logistics, like it was somehow very difficult to besiege cities, but they besieged cities at the time and won at the same time. So Sun Tzu is not what you think it is. It's not like it can't be aligned with von Clausewitz, but it has nothing to do with the positive application of the Clausewitzian theory for the sake of actually winning a war as a sort of manual you can fall back on in certain circumstances. Because that's literally what von Clausewitz does. It's, as we'll see now, it's not even prescribing an action. It's not really even telling us how the Schwerpunkt can't be properly identified. He makes us understand first what the Schwerpunkt is so that we can fully understand, more deeply understand why that's something that we have to strike. But then, since this changes in every war, you have to understand also, von Clausewitz does give a couple of sort of practical examples. For example, he says himself that, especially we'll see now, like the more balanced the odds are, and so tendentially also the bigger the war is, because that tends to align most of the times. Essentially, the physical annihilation of the enemy armored forces is, right, overlapping with the way you're actually going to destroy the enemy. But it's not like this happens in a directly proportional way. For example, this is understandable, like think about attrition and then sudden collapse, all right, like on a battlefield or in war at different levels. So the constraints of this Newtonian analogy of the barycenter would definitely obscure Clausewitz's deeper insight if you just take it in an absolute sense, right? Because also, if you consider von Clausewitz's use of the absolute term always, loses precision upon further elaboration, or better. Again, von Clausewitz explains to us how complicated it is to sort out what the Schwerpunkt is, but how you can somehow sense it in many ways. Von Clausewitz is quite crystal in this, and differently from Jomini that was saying, well, basically at the time in linear warfare during the Napoleonic era, we should, watch at every angle, at every physical, also geometrical dimension of the battlefield to calculate where's the best firepower, the forces, reasoning in terms of vectors of physics, pure physics. For Clausewitz tells us that that's a waste of time. You can't calculate that in a battle. Or you can't calculate it contingently through the chain of command, who's in charge there or not, but what truly matters is fundamentally moral forces, and it's fundamentally the capacity of the commander to be under this massive strain that he suffers way more than even the guy who's, dying in the front line, because not just all the responsibility is on him, but because he's also literally pressed by and inundated by this huge amount of insights, false information, like the fog of war, all what seems, especially in the critical moment of the military situation, the thing that would make you give up, right? And that instead, for Clausewitz says, unless, there is something particularly wrong in your plan, like at some point, if you start, you already see it's a disaster, you should stop. But in general, he says, like in moments of crisis, it's useless actually to step back. Once you're in, go full into it. And then it's actually that strength that will allow you to prevail. Because at the end of the day, it is really a clash between moral forces. Von Clausewitz really believes that there is no trick to win a war, but how motivated fundamentally you are. You understand how also important in a broader cultural, anthropological, politological implication sense this implication is. And von Clausewitz, by the way, continues in the same passage that we cited before. He says, the armed forces of all belligerents, whether a single state or an alliance, possess a certain unity and consequently a degree of interdependence. Remember always the connection, of war as an instrument of politics with other means. And where such interdependence exists, he says, the concept of a center of gravity can be applied. Similarly, he's saying, within these armed forces, there are specific centers of gravity that, through their movement and orientation, influence all other elements, and these centers of gravity are located where the forces are most concentrated. This separation of the international dimension, it's in the national one in military terms, which is, in the former sense, are mostly political, at least in the way that eventually, the control on the relative national armed forces is concerned, and then at that point still political sense in yours, but also one that at that point descends into the military dimension, must be sorted out as a Schwerpunkt. And von Clausewitz says that the Schwerpunkt is present in both dimensions because, for example, the way he describes, a state that cannot defend itself, what are his allies doing, for example, in the moment. That's a beautiful passage, by the way, he makes with a reference to the Polish partitions, right? And he's full of consideration there. He literally says, if a country can't defend itself, it's simply going to be at that point parceled out, even among the allies, which is exactly what happened with Poland back in the day. The concept of interdependence, this is crucial. Von Clausewitz tells us there are some strings, essentially, that keep these relations together, and if you this is not what we use, but if you cut them, if you basically have this big glue dissolving, everything collapses. You can see it in that way. And this glue can be lots of different things, because as you understand, it's also and primarily a moral thing, right? It's not merely lack of resources. Also because at that point, war would otherwise revert to politics, right? Would not probably even be fought. Right? But otherwise, given that most important wars are fought by balanced systems, it's definitely very important to understand what is the place that you have to strike, what is in this the place figuratively intended that you have to strike in order to make the whole thing collapse. This would be the center of gravity. Von Clausewitz says, however, just as in the realm of inanimate objects where the impact on the center of gravity is proportional and constrained by the interdependence of parts, so it is in warfare. So at that point he draws again the Newtonian parallelism, but he does that by saying, look, it's basically similar. It is the same thing conceptually. Naturally, in the realm of inanimate objects, things work very differently than in war, and this is what the double thread, the double dimensions and level that people do not want to get when looking at the von Krieg, because it requires sort of complex thinking. Of course, that's pretty complicated for many people. And so you can understand that if there is a balance that you're keeping through different pieces, if you take away one, like the whole thing can collapse, even just by, a gravitational force. So in this way, the German theorist describes a sophisticated organizational system, emphasizing the importance of analyzing its functional, essentially systemic and environmental dynamics to prevent inefficient expenditures of intellectual and military resources. Because, by the way, you must be very well aware, let's repeat it, what your Schwerpunkt is. And so also what the enemy can do with that while you're trying to make him full of right of balance, so to say. And this idea is reinforced later in the Von Krieg. For example, in Book 8, Chapter 9, that we can translate this way, because there are also different ways you can translate the Von Krieg. Again, it depends essentially on the German. If you haven't followed the text proper and you're looking at certain terms and maybe you forgot how von Clausewitz used them before to say what, like you may actually mistranslate, and so rigging a little bit the fundamentals, and says, two fundamental principles govern the entire plan of war and dominate everything else. That is, reduce the enemy's power to the smallest possible number of Schwerpunkte, of centers of gravity, ideally to one. Similarly, limit the blow against these centers to the smallest possible number of main actions, ideally one, right? And consider all subsidiary actions as secondary as possible, right? So in short, the first principle is concentrate action to the maximum, act as quickly as possible, no pauses, no detour, without compelling reasons, von Clausewitz says, right? So you understand why people may, for example, interpret this mostly as tactics, by the way, because people also don't know the difference between strategy and tactics, so they even consider strategy in that sense as tactics, because they play video games, right? Mostly. FPSs and so on. For the record, by the way, if you're interested in a Clausewitzian definition, strategy is the theory of the use of combats for the object of the war, while tactics is the theory of the use of military forces in combat, which already by itself makes great clarity about what we're discussing. But aside from these points, the meaning of the passage we've just read is really clear. There is essentially the necessity to concentrate force, because von Clausewitz says something also that people would find banal, but it's not banal at all. It's telling you how the truth is always at our reach, but we don't reach it because we overcomplicate things. You know what's literally the best strategy for von Clausewitz? To be very strong. And if you think about it, it is actually true. This aligns with what we've just read, because essentially if you can knock out an opponent with just one punch, you don't need all little tactics around. Actually, like if you need to jump around, normally that's, as we've seen also often in our strategy videos, you're the weaker side, right? You have to overly elaborate to continuously use combinations of combats in order to wear out the enemy, not really being able to deliver the final blow. So what von Clausewitz is telling us here is that if you can spot exactly what can knock the enemy out completely, you should simply go for it. And in this sense, not wasting. You should identify the right objective. You can call it, in this sense, the Schwerpunkt, as the Schwerpunkt and the objective of an action are sort of different things, right? They're not quite identical because they're not dialectically identical in the Clausewitzian theory. But it's obvious that if you have the greater force, because that's how you tend to sort of destroy the enemy more easily, it's completely useless not to use it, right? Giving up the initiative to the enemy, especially if you are at an advantage, is deleterious, right? The same concept of defense, that is actually the strong form of war, but with a negative element in that sense, is to sort of wear out the enemy but only in order to be able at some point to counter-offend, and at that point to deliver your final, hopefully final blow. Von Clausewitz says also beautifully that for all the people who say, this was decisive, this is determinant, that the only decisive battle is the last in a war, according to von Clausewitz. This is also deeply, telling of how and why wars are fought, right? They're always political instruments, and there isn't such a thing. Like in theory, you could go at full war. Like von Clausewitz, for example, uses the term not total war, which was a misunderstanding. Nazis, for example, used at some point, the famous Voltaire den Totalen Krieg in 1943. Von Clausewitz uses the term absolute war because he says essentially in that metaphysical vision that if you could maximize violence in order to achieve your goals in that way, through also sheer level moral force, you could simply, first of all, there would be no war. You would have already won it in that way. But in this sense, you would have, in fact, an action that is absolute from politics, or at that point, it would be literally just pure energy, pure God, pure divinity, which also aligns that's not what von Clausewitz actually says. He's going to talk about God. But that's what sort of theologically, cosmologically, metaphysically, that we very well know, like in history of religion as a concept. And remember that von Clausewitz definitely did come from a religious background. It's not like this is peregrine to his understanding. Von Clausewitz makes actually an excellent work at explaining what war is, just talking about war in the Von Kriege. So much so that people have at some point difficulty understanding even the paradigm of war as a continuation of politics with other means, because they see that von Clausewitz at the end of the day does not talk much about politics in the work, if not in relation to properly how with the military instrument, and vice versa in that sense, because this overlaps in the real world, right? In the real world, the Trinity is, again, still government, people, and military at the same time can be the same people, all right? But because in this sense, people do not understand that it's just the military side that he's discussing within that dimension in the moment. It's as if you were talking about the Holy Trinity and you were discussing at that point the meaning of the Holy Ghost. You can't, it's obviously overlapping in reality with something, but it also has a specific function and dimension on its own. Equally, when we talk from a merely military point of view, von Clausewitz shows us that that's how essentially military logic should follow, but politics constantly come to mitigate that, right? This is incredibly important because it is also based on the concept of motivation itself. That is to say, the Vietnam War. Why did the Americans lose the Vietnam War? Because they didn't have the power of destroying Vietnam. Or why didn't the Romans permanently occupy Scotland or Ireland? Because they didn't have the military power? Obviously not, right? There was something else at play there that made them decide that it wasn't the case, right? But otherwise, warfare follows a particular logic, and you can see, in this time of war, when I stopped talking about the Von Kriege at large, there weren't all these wars around, unfortunately. But as you've seen in the last years, just being hopefully at least exposed to news, to information, especially the war in Ukraine, because, the Gazan thing is not something that particularly interested me in general, also because it was much less important by magnitudinal scale. But you understand how everything, how deeply entwined the two aspects are, how obviously the military action is very much connected with the political agenda in any case, and how, but by the way, von Clausewitz points this out, that there is no direct proportionality normally. Even just, for example, the news are something that can spread within the same army, even though maybe they're false, they're fake, and causing some military effect. Why? Because of course, there is a dimension that controls warfare, and if you influence that, you can change things. And much of the incapacity of people to look at how, for example, wars are fought, and they actually go, and to have an objective assessment of the military situation, is that they tend not to look at this double thread between politics and warfare, and in that sense, they conflate, one will to fight with, some military situation. And that's not actually how things work. They are entwined, but they do not reflect, that the state is bigger, it has to win. No, that's not how it works. Actually, David beats Goliath. It has, even usually as the offender, much greater problems, and the greater challenge most of the times, not always, because it always changes, but tendentially we can see patterns, and that's also from Clausewitz drew his theory from military history. It has, in a sense, less to gain. It has to consume much greater resources, and victory and defeat are actually relative. There are wars in which, in that sense, both sides, or all sides, can lose. We talk about the Vietnam War. Everybody lost in the war. There wasn't a single winner of the Vietnam War. This is not a rhetorical figure. It's literally, like, if you think about this, at the end of the day, when the war ended and the sum of the trade of exchange came back into the hand of politics, everybody had lost. There wasn't anyone who gained something that was sort of deemed satisfactory. Regardless of the differences, of course, as well. So, put differently, moving beyond the physical metaphor, that is interesting, as we've seen. It can help really in its debunking, or its criticism at least, to understand probably what von Clausewitz means also by something you can call as a center of gravity. Von Clausewitz views war as a clash between organized entities, right, characterized as dynamic, complex, and synergistic systems composed of numerous components, each with its own center of gravity. Again, these components are not, just this or that physical or organic dimension. You can ideally split even the main Schwerpunkt that you have, in this sense, to try to compact, right, for the whole system, right, as a sum of all these smaller Schwerpunkte, right? You understand how fluid and changing this thing is, how malleable, how also unpredictable, like war at large, by the in relative terms to the importance of the action and the outcomes. Like, it's the thing that is more risky than all of them. Also define the notion that would be some barbaristic thing, like culturalists have oddly come up with, in a completely idiotic way. Civilizations make war better, right? They destroy, but they win more, and the more advanced you are, the more potentially destructive you become. War is actually the most counter-instinctive thing ever. It's not an instinctual animal thing, all right? Animals clash with a logic, with an order, yes, but nothing of what mankind can sophisticatedly achieve, right? That the former is just like the lower level of this. By the way, in the Blitzkrieg, there is this beautiful assessment that von Clausewitz makes of the so-called savage peoples that he uses as a paradigm of the undeveloped, right? He makes exactly this distinction that also shows, by the way, that he understood incredibly well warfare, including tribal one, way before the Napoleonic era, because most people are telling you that he's just talking about 19th century warfare. You would have not understood, the Air Force, the Blitzkrieg does not talk about this, it's missing it. No. What is written in the Blitzkrieg is valid, absolutely valid, had you read it, because that would be enough for all ages, right? The reason why von Clausewitz uses examples from the Napoleonic era also to be expendable for the time, because this is what the work was also written for, is just for the sake of example, that is to say, for showing how the pattern of the axioms of warfare is true, also, and especially in the moment in which warfare had reached the greatest level of power, of destructiveness, the greatest scale in the history of mankind. But it's not like von Clausewitz is basing himself on a Napoleonic paradigm of warfare. He talks just how you should line up people and to shoot with muskets. He doesn't even care about that. He's talking mostly strategy, as a matter of fact, and he does so in a pretty absolute sense. That's something that I personally applied very well for my medieval studies, because of course the strategic principles are always the same. Von Clausewitz also stresses the importance of optimizing the path of attack towards the Schwerpunkt, which may not be the most direct route, in fact, but rather the one that minimizes the dispersion of forces by following paths of least resistance. And here we're not just talking about a real path, but figurative ones, meaning that in order to strike, for example, as we were talking about before, when you're in a condition of inferiority relatively to your enemy, your attritional proceedings, exploiting defensive, etc., are going to take a longer time before you can get to the point, as we were saying before, when you can deliver the initial blow, right? And so things can and will get pretty complicated, also because, and always remember this, the bigger warfare, the more balanced the odds are, right? This is incredibly important to understand, because otherwise the scale alone would sort of destroy one side, the weaker side earlier, that wouldn't probably even take the field at that point. And in this sense, also the bigger the armed force and the more fatigue, right, the more friction it would make. Von Clausewitz notoriously discussed this at great length. So war is a pretty big business because it's never an isolated act. It's never starting by accident, essentially. There is always a strong political will, especially the greater the greater what is at stake, really, this war, and in fact the military engagement. But in fact, you wouldn't have such a big thing if the enemy wasn't capable of withstanding that either. Now, regarding the dynamic formation of the Schwerpunkt, Clausewitz is even more explicit. Let's read Book 8, Chapter 4. Quote, "What theory can say is this: never lose sight of the predominant relationships between states. From these, a specific center of gravity is formed, the focal point of power and movement from which everything else depends, and against this center of gravity of the adversary, the collective blow of all forces must be directed." This is the preponderance of politics over the military instrument. Also, be aware that the term theory is not understood as some kind of abstraction. This is the theory that based on actual evidence that informs, in fact, itself through the pattern showed by military history. That is crucial in that sense, because whether you're a commander that leave that in first person, or you're a military historian, you're actually looking at the same thing, right? And you gather all the information from that. You may not fully know ever what really happened 100%, but altogether, the more military history you actually study, campaigns and battles, the more you can trace these mechanisms. And we know very well, of course, that at that point, as von Clausewitz also explained already before this passage, politics controls everything, and so it's mostly a matter of, not just scoring a military result, but doing it so for the sake of some specific political purpose. This, for example, founds some incredibly important strategic implications, meaning that, as we said before, warfare can't be just like two armies that are fighting against one another with the heads of states just looking from the other side. First and foremost, because everybody's involved, right? First of all, the military is there because politics told them to do so, but at the same time, it's the same people that sort of supports the government and also makes up the armed forces that is involved. So this is not an isolated dimension, and that's why the military one, the political one, is the most important of the Trinity, is crucial. Probably in the directive function of the same. We will talk at some point better about the Clausewitzian Trinity, but that's also, for example, very counterintuitive for most people, right? If I told you, for example, in this age of rampant lesser peoples, fourth estate populism, and superstition, and conspiracy theory, that politics is the most rational element of the world people, this idea would be rejected, because lesser people naturally have to think that, they are better than their own government. Instead, in every time in history, you get exactly the kind of government that you deserve all the time. There's never an exception. It's directly proportional. It's yet another metaphysical reality. And if you're not in power yourself, it's also because you're not enough of a person, as a matter of fact, to have that. Now, So when you look at the theory, you realize that the Schwerpunkt is not merely a resource, as, for example, the U.S. armed forces would like to make believe by the definition that U.S. doctrine might imply, really, a source of strength or a vulnerability. That's complete insanity. Whoever wrote that has a brain that literally does not work, that truly has not understood the Krieg, but has not also even ever properly waged warfare in the way we understand. This is particularly important because people are convinced also by the aforementioned superstitions that there are the butchers that send the poor people to war, and not that the people are directly responsible for that, as much as the fact that military theory is just some strange abstraction of the evil people that want to play toy soldiers with somebody else's lives. Right? Because, of course, lesser people have no idea of how war is waged, and even when they are sent to the front, that's in the virtue of individual people without any other strategic understanding, which they might actually have, and in part they have, because, if you go to war at the end of the day, you understand what's actually going on, not from the other side of the globe just through X, right, for that matter. But in that sense, like, if you're not, if you don't experience what it means to be in command, you cannot understand how crushing and overwhelmingly crushing compared to any other part of the armed forces that thing really is, right? And to each its own, right? People in command are not common people, right? The qualities required are something beyond the vast majority of the population that has absolutely nothing to do, even remotely, with that, right? And should not flatter themselves, because being a martyr or victim is just a hallmark of weakness, of inferiority, not something you should parade, be proud of. Now, in any case, when you look at this, you realize that the Schwerpunkt is not even simply the origin of a system's capacity to act, right? It is something else. It's really descriptive of an abstract point where the true lines of force among the elements of the conflicting systems achieve a momentary and mutable balance under their mutual influence. In other words, you may not even understand what your Schwerpunkt is while that is constantly operating, as a matter of fact, right? So the Schwerpunkt is not a precondition. It's not something you have to jump from, or that you can weaponize. Or the Schwerpunkt is really what keeps the system working, all right? And a blow on it in the moment can make the entire thing collapse if properly calibrated and delivered, all right? So it's obvious, naturally, how in balanced situations, so in warfare, in the most important cases, it is difficult, in fact, to win. for that very reason, that especially during a heavy blow with all your forces, ever more complicated, the bigger your forces are. There is much friction, a lot of dispersion of forces. There are sort of specific operational tempos, as we know, and most of the time during war, you're not actually fighting. And all of this is propedeutic to the achievement of the enemy Schwerpunkt as a target of destruction. So this abstract point may align with a specific component of the belligerent system, right? Thereby becoming its Schwerpunkt, but it is in that sense not the object in itself, meaning that if the Schwerpunkt is the number of your forces, your morale, a point in the battlefield, something like that. And here we're talking just from a strictly military point of view. It's not like these individual things are the Schwerpunkt, or at some point are set as the Schwerpunkt by someone for some strange reason. No, this is like a ghost that permeates them, because the relations between all these elements are basically concentrated in that element, that moment, but can also pass to another. And in fact, there are sort of critical moments in warfare where things change quite brusquely, but at that point that withdraws the Schwerpunkt in ways that can be very difficult even for those who have temporarily gained an advantage, right? You understand that there are different layers and scales. As we explained here, the Schwerpunkt is a concept that can hierarchically be subdivided. You know probably of Leibniz and this idea of all the possible, these monads that constitute ideally infinitely, like sort of so many matrioskas that can replicate themselves, inflating, deflating, but still being ultimately forever divisible. Well, this is what, however, you can substantiate this ghost with. Like, the Schwerpunkt is real. It is truly the nevralgic center of it all. Not every critical vulnerability qualifies as a Schwerpunkt, for example. Some people think that a Schwerpunkt is the weak point of the enemy or the strong point. As a matter of fact, it can be both, right? It doesn't, or maybe not. It can maybe neither. This depends, right? For example, that's a weak point. If you attack it, actually you're going to earn. Well, that's maybe not even leading to anywhere where the system is particularly weakened by that. Maybe just a weak point, but not actually being the one on which the system rests, right? We'll understand this better now with some example. In fact, not every critical vulnerability qualifies as a Schwerpunkt, nor, say, do all the sources of power to act within a system. Failing to pinpoint the primary Schwerpunkt among or beyond these elements can result in an efficient scattering of forces or futile concentration that weakens other sectors, leaving one more exposed. It's relatively understandable. You may be spending yourself in a, to some, for example, the Kursk offensive in the Ukrainian war. That was explicitly political. There wasn't anything militarily relevant there. It was just to show that you could set foot in Russia, that it would take forever to dislodge the Ukrainians. But it had a moment, it's just a pure political leverage in the moment in which Trump was being settled and at the White House. And that's it. Right, there were some resources diverted from other points. Even in the bigger sort of strategic picture, may have been, in fact, a waste of time passing on an offensive of that. But politically speaking, what could be gained, also in military terms, from that was definitely well spent. Right, and there are many different examples you could make of this. Critical vulnerabilities serve as key pathways to the Schwerpunkt and may themselves act as Schwerpunkt within subordinate systems. However, attacking a vulnerability without identifying the system's Schwerpunkt leads to a squandering of resources. Again, they're not the same thing. All right. And also, by the way, if the Schwerpunkt was instead the strong point of the enemy, we'll try to attack it. In that sense, we can argue today in the Russian invasion of Ukraine that all the Donbas fortification, last line of fortification, is the biggest Ukrainians have in that sense, is, and also the ones that have been gradually grinded in the previous years, are in many ways constituting a substantial part of the Schwerpunkt, especially in that, yes, in the bigger picture, in any case, you can try to make the arithmetic economic sum of how relevant that is. There's not much a way to get past that, right? If there were a way to simply outflank that, you would say, oh, well, we basically struck the Schwerpunkt because that is done for now. But how can you get there, especially in a bigger war? Like, unless things start decaying, like how do you even get there? It's just frontal attacks with enormous losses. And from the Ukrainian side, in many ways, the idea that there would be a gradual grinding of resources of this disproportionate amount of losses the Russians suffered would gradually lower the Russian will to fight and their capacity to sustain the war in a sort of cost benefits ratio, right? And also that is not easy to achieve. So you understand why a stalemate, for example, exists. Now, Clausewitz focuses on the impact of an action, not the inherent qualities or capabilities of the components that produce or endure that impact. As we said before, what you have to strike is this almost ghostly dimension. It's the interconnection between the elements that you are attacking. It's not what they actually are, what they do, right? It's not a material, an essential characteristic that this or that element have. Like it can switch constantly from one another, right? From different aspects that are not even part of the armed forces per se, but again, it can be literally a physical place that is not yet controlled by the enemy. Now, driven by an almost desperate desire to reduce the brutality of war through rapid resolution, because, as you know, he starts the von Krieg as saying, whoever thinks that war can be won just trying to be a bit softer with it just knows that that's the best way to create more dead, right? The best way in a war is to give the toughest blow possible in the shortened amount of time possible to just destroy the enemy in that sense, making fall off from the barycenter all of a sudden, rather than trying to give those little pokes in the end that do not really lead anywhere and just maybe something unnerving but incredibly protracted over time, maybe getting to the point eventually, but unnecessarily prolonging the war, and actually at some point having still more people, dead. It's like saying, I don't know, if you can use a gun other than punches to take down someone, well, go for the gun. That's the point, all right? And the Clausewitz argues that the greatest disruption to a balanced system is achieved by targeting the point where effort yields also the maximum effect, its barycenter. So again, this example, for example, that I made is mostly proportional not to the weapon per se, but to the type of force that you can use. But that's not even the point. The point is how you use it. If you, in that case, in fact, the gun is much more effective too, so it overlaps. But let's say the greatest point here is not much simply going by absolute force, but using it with the minimal amount that is, however, disproportionately destroying the enemy, which ideally is to be achieved in an asymmetric way. Warfare is asymmetrical by definition. There isn't such a thing like symmetric warfare or asymmetrical warfare. There are systems that are tendentially symmetrical, but they're never symmetrical. Otherwise, it wouldn't be war. We would have literally one equal force against another equal force, another way to spend it. So it's zero, and there wouldn't even be a war, right? Or it would be mutual destruction, at least in an absolute term. Here, instead, it's all about like the most genial way to obtain that result, which is that it should never be considered as a shortcut either. Because as we explained, this could be a thing, the smaller the engagement is, in terms of probably of absolute simplicity, there you can have Rambo-style kind of things taking place. A guy killing 30 people, say. It's not that frequent, but it can happen more frequently at that level. If you're talking about two major regional powers, that doesn't happen. There isn't a regional power that takes out other 30 powers of that same scale, right? It's never happened. Or it could happen in theory, but it's so unlikely compared to smaller engagements, even in the same level of ratio strength between the two contenders, that it's sort of very telling also friction especially. Now, in Book 8, Chapter 4, Clausewitz shifts from this compelling abstraction to provide a striking list of potential Schwerpunkte. And he makes historical examples that we learn to read, by the way, from the von Krieg, because they're sort of realities that you can well relate to in military history. Alexander, Gustavus Adolphus, Charles XII, Frederick the Great, von Clausewitz says, had their center of gravity in their armies. Think about this. If these had been shattered, their action would have been abruptly halted. Right? If you had, especially to push, here every situation was different. But these are tendentially all commanders that were essentially going at the enemy, often into enemy territory. They were dramatically on the offensive, and at that point, the best way you could hope to take them out was, yes, you could oppose an equal army, etc., but mostly trying to wear them out, right? To gradually logorate their army proper. It wasn't about having, they didn't have simply another army of that kind, all right? They could, in different ways, sort of replicate one, but the point there is you take out their army, everything is over. Whereas, Clausewitz says, some of their opponents didn't even, they had an army, because everybody fights with an army in that sense, but it's one army could have been replaced by another one. If you're talking guerrilla, especially if you're talking sort of many other circumstances. For Clausewitz says, in states torn by internal factions, the center of gravity, the Schwerpunkt, is generally the capital. For small states, so it's a place actually. It's not an army, right? If you control the capital, you may also not have an army. You may be an insurrectionist force, but you're, generally speaking, you have the upper hand in that sense. Because, for example, the army cannot be supplied without the capital. This is an acute observation. So you understand how in a war like that, the army is not the Schwerpunkt. Because owning the capital really voids even the use of an army. He says, for smaller states relying on more powerful ones, the center lies in the army of those allies, which is kind of obvious, by the way. In alliances, so it's your Schwerpunkt. And you understand how the latter example is not an internal one, but it's truly like something that it's delegated to something that's not even in your control, if not mildly in a political sense. It's somebody else's army. You don't command it, right? Von Clausewitz says, in alliances, the Schwerpunkt resides in shared interests as well. If you have a will to fight, the common enemy, for example, like that is alone what you want to keep alive, especially if the alliance, mathematically speaking, keeps you alive from a military point of view. So you understand also there are different levels of this. It says, in insurrections, in the person of the main leaders and the public opinion, right? It is towards these targets that blows must be directed, von Clausewitz says. So this list surprises only those unfamiliar with Clausewitz's philosophy, by the way, for whom public opinion and government hold as much weight in war as an army. We've seen it recently also with the creation of the Landwehr and the broader ferment that existed in Prussia for the modernization of the army itself, for example, for the need of political reform, etc. So this was exactly the mechanism that would allow the German army to be created on the same Clausewitzian basis for what happened in Prussia in the following decades. Now, the most effective way to disable an adversary, preventing them from obstructing one's goals, is to target this barycentric point of their structural system, which varies greatly depending on the context. Identifying the Schwerpunkt is the leader's critical task, reflecting either their brilliance or potentially their inadequacy as well, so that you must acquire veritable sensitivity to it, right? Mostly through experience. But there is a particular genius and predisposition as well. Equally crucial is accurately identifying one's own Schwerpunkt, as we were saying, as it enables an organization to comprehend its own dynamics, maintaining equilibrium among its components, and facilitate a collective effort in the most efficient and impactful way. You can't just look at the enemy's Schwerpunkt and not realizing what your own is, because the enemy is constantly going at it. And what is important in the Clausewitzian theory is also that he shows how this happens all the time. I mean, war is not a matter of, as we've seen here, there are capacities, there are leaders that are more or less capable and so on, but it's not like the Schwerpunkt came less at any point during this. They always exist, regardless of who sees them or not, and war is fought along that pattern. Meaning that even if means are improperly directed, still the Schwerpunkt of both contenders are there. They continuously make the war work the way it does, right, when it's led, even by an oblivious leadership. The Schwerpunkt, in fact, must also be viewed in its active capacity, capable of delivering decisive offensive power. So not something which is technically instrumental, but it is, inherent, the mechanism that you're employing, and thus is the precondition for certain action to be specifically taken, right? Consistently, von Clausewitz does not prioritize or differentiate a specific level of warfare for the Schwerpunkt. Strategic, operational, tactical levels each possess their own, and they are interconnected. So that's also probably the most challenging aspect of this all. That is to say, that the chain of command, actually, like the various ranks in the hierarchy, are specific deputed to look at all these various levels on their own. But even at that point, it's not much the fact that they are all, fixating with their own Schwerpunkt, and then the rest does not matter, right? The Schwerpunkt, there is an overarching Schwerpunkt that even transcends the military dimension, as we've seen. And then at that point can be something even metaphysical in nature. It can be something existential in some absolute sense, right? But in this sense, you are the higher in the hierarchy, the more aware what is fundamentally happening across all the levels that are not even really, you don't really necessarily need to see in ultra detail, right? The more you know about them, okay, but let's say in the moment in which you're acting also against the enemy Schwerpunkt, the coup d'oeil, right? That this capacity to simply grasp what's going on and having this sense, this intuition fundamentally, that it's an instinct, it's something that you can acquire without even being able to explain how or why. It's actually a very shared experience. We fixate on fixating. We fixate on how we can categorize, how we can simply stop at a point, how we can measure. This is why people have such a great difficulty in understanding the Clausewitzian theory, because people are fundamentally weak in our era. They don't understand that mankind has a potential capable of harnessing incredible forces. People think about the AI, that they can essentially not understand reality true at all, but that this thing is going to do the thing by itself. And that what reveals the existential inferiority of a being, right? And that's the one that is wiped out in war. All this is interconnected, and not understanding that weakens a civilization, weakens an existence, weakens power, weakens the God-given right to rule over other people, right? Now, the Schwerpunkt in historical context is also fascinating, because we could talk about different sort of instances before. We mentioned the Blitzkrieg, but it could go well beyond, right? I never really made a video about Blitzkrieg. I talked about something like about World War II. We sort of saw some of that in action, but it's essentially, if you were to follow the crowd and say, what about Blitzkrieg? What about the Nazis in World War II? What were they up to in a military sense? Well, what we call the Blitzkrieg was essentially a reinterpretation and application of the German-Prussian military principles of Bewegungskrieg. So, the war of movement. And Gefecht der verbundenen Waffen, that is to say, battle of combined arms, in the age of internal combustion engines. So I understand von Clausewitz said the Schwerpunkt must be gone after quickly. So the Germans realized, of course, through this specific philosophical understanding of war that von Clausewitz had left them as a legacy and constitutively in their armed forces, that indeed the dynamicization of warfare was a huge deal. It was the case, especially in World War II, because of what had happened in World War I, when everything had been bogged down. It was the case because now there were planes, there were tanks, and unprecedented power to be in movement, probably kinetic capacity to be unleashed. It had historically been understood also in the Clausewitzian era through the Napoleonic mindset of warfare, what had only partially fooled, let's say, commanders before the start of World War I, that in fact the latter would have been some sort of more movemented warfare of some kind. So there is all vocabulary here in German that is very famous. We could, for the sake of example, associate it to the Schwerpunkt matter. For example, the Schwerpunkt could pursue operational goals such as the Kesselschlacht, the Battle of Encirclement, or Durchbruch, the breakthrough, and deep advance based on the principles of Flächen- und Lückentaktik, tactics of surfaces and gaps. The Germans had also simply their own operational ways of doing things. Like every country had sort of dealt in different ways. The Germans were objectively the better force in World War II for most of its time. It's not like they were perfect, though, in the sense that actually no country was prepared at the onset of World War II. Like the Germans themselves sort of topped like their maximum, really went that full extra gear of quality in 1942, where the war was paradoxically also lost already. Just for saying that there were different ways of visualizing it. As we said before, just think about the nationalist, socialist direction of the war and the sort of misunderstanding of certain terms. For example, total war was applied later also to as a negative stigma onto the Clausewitzian theory that instead sort of rejected that idea. Von Clausewitz uses the terms absolute war in the sense, in a totalizing way, just to describe instead how real war is always scaled down compared to that. It's something you should achieve in just in metaphysical principle, but not because real warfare is ever worked like. In any case, it did not have the political meaning that the Nazis wanted to give it, especially at that point in the war, where they had literally lost. So again, doctrine is always complex, also ways applied. No general really thinks in the same way. No army is equal to another, like literally within the same armed forces. So that's something we already know in Schwerpunkt, just out of the sheer amount of military history that we cover, but it should be better understood at some point when we will cover things like Blitzkrieg. And by the way, you could simply ask, are all wars of movement employing combined arms principles considered Blitzkriegs? Certainly not. Also, well, the question doesn't make even sense per se, but let's say the Blitzkrieg, at least as we know it, we define it stereotypically, specifically demands the identification of a precise Schwerpunkt in the adversary's system, contrary to the misconception that involves attacking across the entire front or merely exploiting a weak point, as, again, people oddly still believe. For instance, in the context of the 1967 Six-Day War, some question whether it qualifies as Blitzkrieg. And unlike the German approach, which used tanks and as a spearhead to penetrate enemy lines, while infantry secure resistant positions, the Israelis employed tanks to directly assault fortified positions like Abu Agheila. However, in fact, the essence of Blitzkrieg lies not in specific tactical decisions, but in identifying and targeting the enemy's Schwerpunkt to disrupt their cohesion, right? That's the point. You have to prohibit, essentially, the enemy to have a strategically exploitable use of its armed forces. Like, you have to disarticulate the logic that underpins the use of combats for the end of war. That's it, right? It's to disable that. If you disable that, you don't have to cut everything down in a simply, head-down attack just because, like it can translate in that even at some point if the Schwerpunkt in that particular case requires it, but it's not quite the same. For example, the Israelis in the aforementioned war, swift and decisive actions, particularly in neutralizing the Egyptian Air Force, aligned with this principle, although their multi-pronged attacks, for example, Kuntila, Abu Agheila, differ from the concentrated breakthroughs typically associated with German tactics as well, because it's different, simply another context. So you understand here how actually warfare never changes, in the sense that there is, it's actually the doctrine of the two natures, traditionally speaking. There is a dynamic that never changes. And what you see in reality is just what basically it instantiates itself in its imperfection, incapable of reaching that absolute stability and plenitude. It's the same concept of God, and the same concept of the doctrine of struggle and victory of the old classical world. Now, the fluid nature of the Schwerpunkt is crucial here, because you could say also, but it's almost inescapable. Like, it's always changing, and you can't sort of subdivide it into different parts. So let's clarify this further. Clausewitz's armies on the battlefield should be seen as fluid, constantly shifting structures. Like any structure, they possess a barycenter, their point of balance, the Schwerpunkt. For Clausewitz, the Schwerpunkt was a, quote, critical dynamic point, not merely as a static, strong or weak one, as we explained, though it was through this oversimplified interpretation that the concept gained widespread acceptance. And in a terribly wrong way. Right, that's why it remained, let's say, there is some to it. It's not like von Clausewitz's Schwerpunkt can't be aligned with this concept, as we've seen, but it's not in absolute terms, right? And it's brusquely erratic to presuppose so even. It remained a sort of crucial guide for military operations, but in this sense, it is wrong in strictly Clausewitzian terms, and therefore also the ones that correctly describe war. At any level, strategic, operational, or tactical success is achieved by directing the attacker's maximum effort towards the defender's Schwerpunkt, where their cohesion is most vulnerable. But the same thing can be switched, like the same defender can go at the enemy's Schwerpunkt just through also the weaker form of war that the attack is, that requires actually a much greater combination of the Clausewitzian trinity, and it has the positive aim because it's going somewhere and not giving up the initiative to the enemy, but still, is more costly. Gerhard von Scharnhorst, that we have recently remembered in our video about the Prussian Landwehr, and so the foundation probably of a citizen soldiery, as opposed to some subject arms, recognizing the intellectual brilliance of a young officer not yet 30, selected Karl von Clausewitz as his assistant. Clausewitz's ideas profoundly influenced the understanding of warfare and the development of strategic culture. His masterpiece, von Krieger, remains for this reason unparalleled in military history. There are really many ways to approach that. I personally like studying von Clausewitz. Was one of the most enlightening, experiences in my life. Again, it opened to further enlightenment just through other knowledge and more. It provides you probably with a pattern, with a method, with a philosophy, with a certainty. There is a clarity in his idea. It's something that speaks to your moral dimension. It's not something abstract, cold. That's mostly like the précis de l'art de la guerre. It's the concept of internal lines. It's Jomini. That is the cold, abstract, geometric notion of the battlefield. The Clausewitzian one is actually pretty messy. It's actually what life turns out to be, and it teaches you really how to just take that by the horns and going on, like guiding it where it needs to go. And that's why, for example, like if you look back in the day when I also abandoned the von Krieger series, there was a very specific reason too that overlapped with the other factors I told you about. And it is actually that real. It is actually that painful to realize how the world goes and, why, etc. But it's also the only way to accept what really goes on and trying to make a change for the better. And rather than providing rigid rules, von Clausewitz, drawing on real-world war experiences, encouraged military leaders to navigate this chaotic and ever-changing environment. That's the most beautiful thing in Clausewitzian theory, if you think about it. It's really about learning how to believe in yourself. Not that, you may not, but let's say giving you properly that advice that from a position where this has already been seen in its most terrible ways, and showing you, look, in life there are just some things you have to do, and you will learn along the way. You will become better at it, and even in the darkest, especially in the darkest moment, that's the moment in which you're closer to victory than at any other point. And it is beautiful in its drama. It's beautiful also to study military history at that point, because you realize that at the end of the day, it's not like things end well. Most of the times, actually, that's always the point, that wars are terrible, not just much because of the absolute level of destruction, but because there's been a purpose to that. Like that there is been some kind of will, there's been some kind of point of objective that surely was worth also fighting for to an extent, but that at some point may have, and this is really very the case in war almost stereotypically, to often go very astray from very different direction, having very different outcomes from the ones you expected. And that's also the beauty of warfare. There is all a scientific, systemic analysis that the von Kriege, sort of like a bit like the theory of games, enucleates, but always with this very strong sense that you are in command, right? That in that sense, the moment of leadership, the moment of the decision, right? The moment of properly also the understanding, not sort of mere action, throwing yourself into the fray without thinking. That only gets you killed. Like von Clausewitz is very clear about that. Courage alone just gets you killed, right? It may be the noblest of the sort of the characters, but let's say it's something that alone just doesn't make you win wars, right? And just think about how people think differently many times at least, but also how wars at some point it's better to believe that courage does it, because at least it has some moral dimension into the assessment, that thinking that war is about logistics, man, because logistics is not even a branch of the art of war. Von Clausewitz explained it very well, by the way, in the von Krieg. Logistics, war is logistics is for actually lesser people. And the Schwerpunkt strategy is for men, by the way. People say tactics is for kids, logistics is for men. No, strategy is for men, right? Tactics is maybe for kids, but logistics is for lesser people. Also because, logistics can be done by even a civilian that has no idea of how eventually it is going to be used. Using logistics in a strategic sense, it's a completely different story. And that's also still a strategic decision, right? A civilian engineer can build a trench, but only a strategist knows how to use it for the end of war. All right, so that's the radical difference. That completely sets apart anyone thinking in the aforementioned terms, completely outside of any trace of military historical understanding. Now, the Schwerpunkt offered a revelation for military thinkers, by the way, for those who were eager to listen. Despite the chaos of war, armies and even nations rely on a Schwerpunkt. This is also probably the most difficult concept to digest. Like, the Schwerpunkt must be worked for. It's not simply, okay, this is a Schwerpunkt, I know it. You actually have to identify it. At some point, we will make a video sort of explaining how that can be done. But it's not something you can simply learn out of mere theory. You must at least see in a political military context how or why that is the case. And studying war is obviously the best way, other than finding one, especially in a position of command. Victory hinges on accurately identifying one's own and locating the enemies to deliver a decisive strike, collapsing their entire war machine in a single blow. And this is obviously ideal, right? It's not ideal in the sense that it's abstract, it's not real. It's ideal in the sense that that's what ideally you should be able to do. But as we know, in reality, as we said before, this is what we constantly fall short of, and that's why wars are that sort of... If that was achieved, again, there wouldn't be even a war, because the sheer will to power would be so maximized that everything would be crystallized, right? Everything would be simply, okay, nobody needs to fight because there is such a deterrent power that freezes everything, which is also what literally happens in the bigger picture, also to a great extent of great powers. Now, the Schwerpunkt's communicative power is also evident as a concept. It's very intellectually provoking, right? Once identified in a planning session, all participants understand their role, supporting their own Schwerpunkt and targeting the enemies with focused effort. Yet, von Clausewitz's theories are practical, crafted by a soldier for soldiers, not abstract philosophy. He viewed war as an art, which is something that, if you notice, I always use the term art with capital A, where military genius, in fact, transcends scientific formulas. This is perhaps the single most important aspect of Schwerpunkt, that is a non-deterministic mechanism. It requires action and not some abstract understanding of the Schwerpunkt, right? Von Clausewitz says that knowledge alone is not also like nailing what the Schwerpunkt is, that does not give you the qualities necessary to pursue that. You must have determination, which is a very specific form of courage, informed by the right knowledge that can come also through all the imperfect ways, and that's why the coup d'oeil is there. That's essentially the best psychological cocktail. Then at most you should also be someone who resists under pressure, that has cold blood, that does not breaks under, that does not despair in the darkness and so on. And very few people have that actual capacity. Now, among the dozen guiding principles in the Fangkriege, the Schwerpunkt is definitely the most difficult to grasp, as we have understood, because it often remains, for most people, it is an abstract concept rather than a tangible entity. Remember that von Clausewitz explicitly says this, that you should learn this stuff just, let's say, if you want to really apply it primarily through experience. Then the Fangkriege serves as a positive manual to explain you how this works, and so seeing everything better in a clearer lens once it is explained to you, but it can't do the thing for you, right? And in this sense, it's very much expendable for command, and that's also often what military historians or political analysts or people who talk about geopolitics and all this BS, I mean, geopolitically speaking, do not kind of get. Like, you should be able to understand how warfare was actually waged and the decisions that a commander has to make within an environment that most of the times you can't either reconstruct, right? Thinking that AI is able to manage that unpredictability of warfare is nonsensical, because if we had a machine that predicts everything, we would be done for better or for worse, right? That's never going to be the case. Technology is the eternal illusion, right? And attempting to systematize a method for calculating the Schwerpunkt effect risks not just oversimplification, but disaster, right? Calculating, like, this is a dialectical point I'm making. The idea of calculating the Schwerpunkt, the idea that there is a measure that you can't write down, that you can't use a calculator literally to sort out, is heavily misleading. Like, it properly defies the concept of Schwerpunkt for how it is gradually built into the Fangkriege. Because again, today we're talking just the Schwerpunkt, because I never made a video about the Schwerpunkt. But again, the Schwerpunkt is as valid as the entire Fangkriege. And you can't understand this even through my video, even though it's probably going to be the best video on YouTube on the topic. But if you don't study the entire work, if you don't understand the most intimate nature and mechanism of the Fangkriege, you can't even come close to get what the Schwerpunkt is in an intellectual sense. If you don't have military experience, you can't really fully appreciate what that is, right? For Clausewitz, telling the truth, like, he doesn't literally voice this in these terms, but let's put it in this way. Imagine you're a coach, right, in sport. Like, coaches are mostly like ex-sporters in a way. They're ex-players. They would know the deal. Who have been in the field, they know it all, right? However, there are also some coaches that actually have a merely observing experience of the sport and know how actually to run things well equally. This is also the case in warfare. There are people who not have military experience but can actually be quite useful in that circumstance and or in informing command in that circumstance. Now, can targeting the Schwerpunkt lead to failure? As we said before, in theory, accurately identifying and striking both one's own and the enemy's Schwerpunkt should ensure success. Meaning striking your own in the sense that you are fully using that your Schwerpunkt enables you to use against the enemy Schwerpunkt, because you understand the full balance of your forces. They are truly entangled. I mean, the strategic logics are very much felt in a muscularly reciprocal way. This is clear also, like just sheer military history. You can almost, feel the pulse of this beat, right? It's like there is a tempo of the operation. There is like an exhaustion of resources. There are critical points. There are sort of moments of recovery and so on. However, the chaotic nature of war means that outcomes unfold on the battlefield where conditions can change dramatically as well. So no formula guarantees victory. Even the quintessential example of the Schwerpunkt application, Fall Gelb, for example, the 1940 invasion of France, owed part of its success to fortune, notoriously enough, but at so many levels, right? Literally at some point, because a plane could fly, also in terrible weather, rather than stopping, like, provided the Fall Gelb operational plan itself, rather than the previous one, it would have likely brought the Germans to defeat. And even that was not automatic. Like, the Germans had to fight it through, and also with, important losses. That had been the case already for Poland, or also against France. It's not like the Germans simply, didn't take losses or they didn't risk it in quiet terms. But again, also all great. This is also what von Clausewitz tells us, and the Fortuna Kaiser perfectly agrees with that from our traditional religious studies. No victory can be achieved without fortune. It's only by chasing fortune and therefore accepting as the gamble that is the character, the second element of the Clausewitzian trinity, that is the military, that either you learn to dance in accepting setbacks and being able to stand up again after those and continue, or you can't properly fight a war. You're unfit. You're not capable of maintaining that rhythm. Now, in modern wars, the Schwerpunkt is unfortunately interpreted in the reductive manner described earlier. This brings to real problems because, as we said before, global armed forces have yet not made the Clausewitzian Schwerpunkt concept their own. They don't understand it. People who make them up again are, I'm not speaking ill of the military. Like, the military on average also has a higher higher IQ than the average. Again, we need the military. We should invest more in the military and all this thing. But exactly for this, also providing with more strategic education. Most military men do not have the palest idea of what the Schwerpunkt actually is. This is a simple truth. Like, it's not a matter of opinion. Let alone people in general, right? In general, even, again, the military can focus on simplistic notions of strength or weakness. We have seen before the US definition of, you can make, for example, this very silly mistake, like, let's take an example, my strength is aviation, so I bomb where I think it will hurt most. Why? Because you have this relative advantage. And what if the Schwerpunkt does not lay what you can bomb? It doesn't mean anything. It's dumb. All right. And this approach frequently deviates from, in fact, the same Clausewitzian dynamic framework. Furthermore, as von Clausewitz compared war to two wrestlers leveraging each other's strength, remember that war is a clash between two moral forces that reciprocally influence one another. There's all a set of laws of reciprocity, where it's not like, again, you can't calculate your Schwerpunkt in a suspense reality and then, just to poke the enemy that minimum to make it. It has to pass through massive bloodshed. All right, it's how actual war is fought. But the Schwerpunkt is truly real. And the way it's messy, it's just because we don't have a tight control. We don't have more discipline. We don't have more resolve. We don't have more resources. We don't have better organization. It's always the same thing. Warfare is often fought in sort of human terms of good enough kind of standards, right? And often also bringing to disasters, to massive setbacks and sort of destruction of all kind, just with mistake after mistake. But still, this is how war in the real world is fought, not because it is, quote, the real world. Yes, it is, but in the sense that this is the direct, is the shortcoming of an absolute nature of warfare in that absolute sense never changes. By definition, warfare changes only in its sort of earthly nature. And we talk again about this in the video about the Holy War in the Age of Dying tradition. And so the Schwerpunkt is inherently fluid. The enemy may shift their Schwerpunkt as you prepare to strike, for example, rendering the action ineffective or even counterproductive. The fluidity highlights why the Schwerpunkt is not a fixed target, but a point of balance that evolves with the war's dynamics. For example, the Soviet deep operations and the Schwerpunkt, it can really highlight how many mistakes can be done. The Soviet doctrine of deep operations, the Glubokaya Operacja, developed from Brusilov to Tukhachevsky, is sometimes likened to the Blitzkrieg, but has little in common with that. It prioritized large-scale, simultaneous, and overwhelming offensives rather than focused operations, aiming to overpower the enemy defenses through sheer magnitude, as seen as Operation Uranus during World War II. Now, it bears some resemblance to the modern shock and awe doctrine, for example, Desert Storm, as you know, notorious Desert Storm, though direct comparisons are imperfect as well. So, as I understand, this was a very important video. It sort of awakened in me some kind of very specific feelings that I had back in the day, and I realized how much of all of this is alive, how much it works, and how much it has informed all my work in all these years. And I don't get emotional easily, right? But let's say, thinking for a moment of how you can rely on these concepts for your own life, and especially going through defeat. I think it's one of the most darkly beautiful privileges that you can get in your life. And when you think that, say, everything is gonna work out fine, and then you realize how changing reality is and how difficult our life can be, especially if we are not going along, sort of, we're not doing the right thing just out of capacity, etc. Wouldn't life be boring if everything went well just without merit? In fact, it never does. And we've seen it also in traditional theology. That's the actual point. That's why von Clausewitz is so close to that. That's how and why I actually discovered, for example, Indo-Europeistics. I already knew about this, but it's only after I studied von Clausewitz that I realized truly what all that meant and how truly traditional these concepts really are. And again, I've never found anyone who treats von Clausewitz in this specific terms. Instead, I think they are very specific and inescapably so. There's a historical dimension. This is very important for a historian like me. The continued relevance, again, living through, certain things, and I want to talk also about my more recent conditions. It's very complicated internationally speaking, but let's say there is something there. Like, I have a very easy life. I'm always here, and I don't really need else, but still you realize that there is a problem of command, of control, of leadership, that there is something that doesn't work, right? It doesn't work because people have no clue about these topics. And you can't go as far as, the roots of Clausewitz's Schwerpunkt can be traced to ancient Western thought, at least to some degree. For example, Anaximander's cosmology. Yeah, right. Yet this historical foundation does not diminish the originality and richness of Clausewitz's ideas, because they are refined. In fact, thousands of Western military civilizational history is put in this way, and it's not by chance that von Clausewitz existed in his own time. And this is a deep, also metaphysical realization if you treat it through the lens of tradition, but it is still, in fact, in reality, in a historical sense, that you must understand. And sort of trying to enter the mentor this genius today, we didn't talk about von Clausewitz much, about the person, about who he was and how this worked and why, etc. So we have to do this. It would be incredibly difficult, in a way, even to appreciate how he came to that, because we will never know. For instance, just like, asking how Mozart came to learn what he did. It's something, however, of disproportionate actuality and expandable, say, positive expandability. Right, learning the learning the Clausewitzian theory does really bring you something, does really allow you not just to win wars, which are, was that the thing, like we would content ourselves, but in your more sort of beginner steps, it teaches you to cope with life. And so it's something that illuminates you. Again, I can't, probably someday we'll make a video explaining what von Clausewitz meant in my life in a sort of interpersonal sense, what I went through while I was studying von Clausewitz, what kind of bitter realities you can acknowledge just by accepting that things can go rough for you and get defeated. But that's probably, I've never really felt so strong as understanding von Clausewitz. Never really felt so. I've actually understood this also through religion. Mostly, I've always sort of felt that. But say von Clausewitz gives a more approachable roadmap to that. It explains you why it is important. It's when sort of everything can be elicited through, spiritual chord, etc. But to mix that, making sense of it with your mind and understanding in that sense how layered reality is, and being able to understand warfare, religion, the world, politics, people, morals, through this entwined veins, arteries, so to say. It's something really direct into the heart of it all. And so nearly 200 years after its formulation, the Schwerpunkt remains a concept ripe for exploration, providing deep insights into the art of war in its application across all the military domains. Never really liked the concept of operational. People like to put into it. To me, I'm very Clausewitzian to the point that I don't recognize that. I mean, I understand what it means. And von Clausewitz talks about military operations in general at length, but the relation between strategy and tactics is much more immediate. There isn't such a thing like operation. Operation is mostly like how you come to do this stuff. And so, yes, ideally you can analyze it, but it's distracting from the focus of politics, strategy, tactics, and in fact, pure military understanding, which sort of the operational side is like putting a patch on it. Okay, now we have to work this so that we can start doing that. Okay, but why are you doing that? What is happening in the meanwhile? You see, the Schwerpunkt is not waiting for you in that race, right? It's not like the Schwerpunkt sleeps, for example, when operations are over, because politics doesn't, because also the army doesn't really. Like, just combat is suspended, but it's not. It's never quite fully so. But let's say the picture changes even during that. So there is there are interesting, of course, levels of analysis that you can accept also through those terminologies. I'm not making the case it's not true that you can't reason through an operational lens. However, because the Schwerpunkte are really infinite, right? But we will see better at some point how this is really declined, because really there is a way to analyze military history that it's not just storytelling, it's not just characters, it's not just some sort of vagary. It's really about realizing that when warfare is waged, these things are at play. And so you can't dismiss them, or at least you can't act as if, you're just listening to the story, but you don't make the effort of understanding what is happening in a position of command, what is happening with making things happen, which is the most difficult thing of all. And so that's the crudest and most beautiful part of warfare, that also makes you colder as a person, makes you actually more efficient and at the same time, it makes you grow. However, things really go. And again, there's a lot of philosophy revolving around even the film Krieg from an outer perspective that would be very interesting at some point to further discuss. Nevertheless, again, honestly, I thank you for this, because in these years, from those times, like you have been here, you've had the channel sort of growing, and again, many of you don't even know that I was doing this stuff before, but that's why we need to talk about von Clausewitz again. We can't simply leave this aside, right? All that we discuss on the channel is directly related with this, and so we should learn how to make it work accordingly. And I really hope that you appreciated this video, because it was a very important one for me, and it tells me lots of things that to an extent I had forgotten, including how much you must believe in yourself when you really have a good reason to. All right. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.